This video will be on time-dependent intensity corrections, or TDI corrections, in Probe for EPMA. TDI is simply a change in the measured intensity as the analysis progresses. This can occur due to beam damage, charge effects, or elements migrating towards or away from the incident electron beam. For example, samples with high sodium will often show a decrease in sodium intensity as it migrates away from the analysis location during the analysis. This can obviously result in some pretty spurious analyses, as the average intensity acquired over the course of analysis will not reflect the initial state of the sample, which is what we want. So, for example, this is the time-dependent analysis. Shown here is intensity versus time, and as you can see, we're going from nearly 1200 counts per second down to 500 counts per second, so over a factor of 2 loss in intensity during the analysis. And as I mentioned, if you took an average, that's going to end up somewhere over here. But we don't really want to know what the average of the analysis is. We want to know what the intensity of the sample would have been if before the beam started interacting with it in its sort of natural state, quote unquote. So something like this is what we really want to know. We want to know what it would be at time 0. Okay. Now, fortunately, PFE has some pretty robust mechanisms for dealing with TDI, and that's what I'll be showing you here. To enable TDI corrections, you must do that before the analysis is performed so that PFE knows to collect that data for you to use later for the corrections. To do that, we want to create a new sample setup. So we're going to go to Acquire. If this window is not open, you can access it here in the main window by clicking Acquire. And we're going to go to New Sample Setup. We can name it whatever we want here. Click OK. And now to access the TDI options, we're going to go down here to Special Options. And here we can turn on the TDI or turn it off. Normal acquisition is no TDI collected. Self-calibration time-dependent intensity acquisition will be where PFE will collect the TDI data at a certain number of intervals, which we can change here during the analysis. You can also toggle whether you want it to collect TDI data on standard samples. I usually do, just so that I can monitor that, but you don't have to. To choose the interval, there is no hard and fast rule for setting the TDI interval. This is going to be the number of intervals that it chooses during the analysis. So a large number would be a lot of short intervals, a small number would be a few long intervals. And you must balance counting statistics and curve fitting when you make this decision. So if the number of intervals is large, you will have lots of data points for good curve fitting, but if the count rates are low, you may have a variability in the measurements due to poor counting statistics that may offset the advantage of having those extra data points. Conversely, if you set the interval too small, you may not see the full variation. For example, if it's curved versus linear, if you've got too few points, you may not be able to establish that variation. But you'll get better counting statistics if you have a longer interval. For example, if you're counting for 30 seconds on the analyte and set an interval of 6, then each interval will be approximately 5 seconds. And if you're at 2,000 counts per second, each interval will have a total of 10,000 counts for statistics purposes, versus if you're at 20 counts per second, then that interval is only going to have 100 counts in that to be for counting statistics precision. So it might be a good idea to do some sort of a pre-flight check, so to speak, and assess the count rates that you're going to be getting at the conditions you choose on the samples you choose before setting this TDI interval. You want to make sure that you have enough to see the trend in the TDI, but you also need to make sure that it's not going to be so sloppy that because of counting statistics. Okay, so once that's done, we've enabled it. We can hit OK, and we're ready to collect the TDI. So once you've enabled it, PFE will acquire the data for the samples, though as you'll see a little later on, you don't have to use the TDI correction even if you collect the data. You can enable it or disable it at will after the fact when you're doing your sample analysis and data reduction. I recommend enabling TDI as the default for basically all samples and elements. You can always disregard the corrections after the fact, but if it is not enabled in the first place, you can't collect that data, so you can't, there's no way to retroactively get the interval data. The only drawback to enabling TDI is that there is a bit of extra analysis overhead time required for PFE to collect and store those intervals. This usually amounts to a few seconds. So unless you're certain there will be no TDI or you're really prioritizing short analysis times, then I like to leave TDI on for all things and then disable it on the back end if necessary. So once you've enabled TDI, you can choose to use it or not use it by accessing the standard assignments dialog, which can be found either here in Analyze. So if you click this, you get this Analyze window shows up and you go to standard assignments, or you can also access it for new sample setups here in standard assignments. So once we've opened this, click on the element row that you want to change, and you'll get the standard dialogues where you can change your assignments and do interference corrections, but also here is our TDI option. So you can turn it off, turn it on, and display the fit if there is data. In this case, there's no data since this is a new sample setup. And you can change the type of fit here. Something to note, if you have an element that is not the first element measured on a spectrometer, so for example, in this setup, you can see here that I have silica first and then aluminum on this spectrometer. You are not allowed to collect TDI data for an element that is not first on the spectrometer. In the case of this setup, we're gonna have whatever 20 or 30 seconds of analysis time before aluminum is even measured. So whatever TDI was happening to aluminum during the silica analysis can't be measured, and therefore PFE sort of locks that out so that you cannot apply TDI corrections to the second element. There are some ways to get around this using multiple sample setups and combining them later, but that's beyond the scope of this video. So just be aware that if you want to measure TDI on an element, it needs to be the first element measured on that spectrometer. Now we'll look at some TDI data and go over options for assessing TDI and choosing appropriate corrections. There's a couple places to access TDI data in PFE and view it and manipulate it. As you saw a little earlier, we can get to it from the standard assignments buttons here in Analyze or in Acquire standard assignments. Just like most things, if you access something from Acquire, it's going to only affect the last sample that was created, whereas if you're in Analyze, you have the option to pick different samples or even pick multiple samples and apply different settings to a bunch of samples at once. So in this case, we're going to look at a couple of examples of TDI. So we'll go into standard assignments. And what's nice about this, like I said, is you can apply one sample to a bunch of different samples. So in this one, we don't have TDI on anything, and in this one, we have it on a couple of elements with linear fit. And let's say I want to apply this condition to all of the samples I've selected. So I choose the one I want, I make the changes I want, whatever I want to do here. And now when I hit OK, it's going to apply those settings to both of the samples I've got highlighted here. There's also another option to see TDI data, and this is more of a sort of global option where you can see a lot of different samples and elements at once, and that's over here in the main PFE window in the Run menu. So we're going to hit Run, Display Time-Dependent and Alternating Intensities. So we click that. It takes a few seconds here for it to load everything. And then we'll get this dialog, and this is really nice because it gives you a way to see a lot of different samples all at once with relatively few clicks to see the different things. So we've got our sample selected. We can look at each different row in that sample. We can look at different elements and kind of scroll through them and check them all to see the differences. You can also, what I really like about this is, let's say I want to see sodium for a whole bunch of different stuff to see how it's varying maybe differently. Once I click into any one of these windows, you can then use the arrow key to kind of jump through them really quick. And that way you can kind of assess a bunch of different samples at once. Or Conversely, let's say you want to assess one sample but a bunch of different elements, so you can kind of bounce through those or look at different lines for the same element. And it kind of remembers your choices as you go to do this, so it keeps it silica all the way through so you can look at them, or sodium, whatever you pick. Another nice thing about this is it has done a few calculations here for you, so you can see the magnitude of the changes you're looking at. So it calculates the integrated intensity. So this would be the intensity that PFE would get if there was no TDI corrections being made. And then it also shows you the y-intercept. So that's what it's going to use as if corrected for TDI. So in this case, we've got a pretty substantial difference between the integrated intensity and the y-intercept, 68% difference. So this is really nice because you can, again, see the magnitude. So here in silica, we've got some pretty obvious TDI. Well, maybe not for every example here. But you can see it's only a few percent, 3 or 4% versus sodium, which can be up to 60%. So again, this is a good way to assess the magnitude of the TDI corrections you're making and how much of an effect it's going to have on your analyses. You can also change the fits here, of course, and then if you want, you can assign that fit to the sample. So if we want to change it to quadratic, we can hit assign fit to sample. Now, one drawback here is that you cannot do TDI fits for individual rows within a sample. So if I hit assign fit to sample, it's going to assign it to all of these rows. I couldn't do, for instance, if I wanted linear on the first one and I wanted quadratic on the second one, you'll see that it changes them all to quadratic at that point. Now there is a trick to get around this. I'll mention it really quickly here near the end of the video. So you can do it, but it requires separating the samples. So we can assign our fits and assess the magnitude of the TDI corrections we're making. Something to note that's kind of interesting here, TDI typically is associated with a decrease in signal as something like sodium migrates away from the beam. But if your TDI is significant enough, it can actually have the opposite effect. And I believe this is related to the fact that essentially as sodium migrates away from the beam and goes down, that's leaving the silica as a greater proportion. I don't think silica is actually being attracted to the beam. I think it's just that as we lose sodium, the proportion of silica goes up. So you can see that we actually need to make a correction for silica. We have a almost 4% change here in silica. As sodium goes down, silica goes up. So we would get poor results for both sodium and silica in this scenario, unless we correct for both. But as I kind of mentioned, it is element dependent. You can see that iron is not really affected by TDI strongly in this sample. And I believe if we actually tried to use these spurious fits, we would actually cause more harm than good in our data. I think an integrated intensity is going to be a much better choice here. So we're going to want no TDI for these and TDI for silica and sodium. And again, we could do that here. So we go in, standard assignments. I'm going to go in and I'm going to turn off TDI, which it already was off. Do that. Now when I hit OK, I've only got a TDI correction for sodium and silica. Lastly, I did want to show you if you do want to, for instance, you've got a sample where you've got a bunch of different phases in a single sample where your rows of data have different samples, you can come in and use a cool new feature in PFE where we can separate the selected samples into new samples. So now if we hit this button, we've got this sample, we're going to hit this. Do you want to do this? We're going to say yes. And it's going to think for a second here, and now we have individual samples where we could theoretically assign TDI fits on an individual basis for each one of those rows. So that's just a little tip. If you do run into a scenario where you need to turn TDI on or off for individual rows, you can do it. Just wanted to end with a real world example of the effects that TDI can have if you don't account for them. So this is one of these examples, and this is the average for all 6 rows in the sample. And you can see with TDI corrections in place and working, we have a nice total. We've got 14% sodium, and everything looks pretty good. When we do not account for that, we've got an 8.8% sodium. So the difference here is 62%. You can also see it in other elements, the other 2 elements here. Remember, silica was actually showing an increase in intensity, so it would have been an artificially high value, and you can see there's an extra 1 weight percent of silica in this analysis, a couple percent relative. So using the TDI corrections when needed is a critical aspect of getting good, precise, accurate results on the EPMA. Hope this video helped, and thanks for watching.